Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you'd like to stop by and visit us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road, and we would love to have you join us for our 9 a.m. Bible study and our 10 a.m. worship, as well as our 4 p.m. worship period every Sunday. You can also find us at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another portion of our Bible study, and we have classes for all ages during those times. You can also get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. And those are great ways to get in touch with us, ask us your questions, sign up if you would like to receive our weekly bulletin, and I write articles for that every week. Those also appear on our website, by the way, so you can find them there just as easily. We also offer a correspondence course that you can sign up for. 6 lessons. You just send me your name and your address and let me know that you want to sign up for that course, and I can get the first installment out, and we just go through God's basic expectations of each individual in this life. We have a radio show that airs every Sunday afternoon at 2, and you can find that at 98.5 FM as well as on 1400 AM if you're a bit farther out from Evansville. And you can also find our YouTube channel, youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, and all of the past TV programs are in a long back catalog on the YouTube channel, as well as our live-streamed worship and Bible study periods every week. So even if you're not able to join us in person, you can still join with us over the internet and use the YouTube channel to virtually worship with us. I want to start in Exodus chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw a basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." I've mentioned before on the show that our year's theme here at River Ridge has been Focus on the Family. And I chose that for the congregation, but that's hardly a unique need to us right now. So I've been letting you follow along, admittedly a bit behind our schedule at church, by taking the lessons that I present to the congregation and then adapting them for a TV show, at least some of the time. I'm behind on a lot of things, as some of you who have written in well know. I appreciate your patience in putting up with me taking a long time to get back with you sometimes. But a little while ago on the show, we looked at the role of husbands and fathers. And especially we considered the burden of responsibility that God places squarely on our shoulders. And if you missed that, then you can, of course, go to our YouTube channel and find that episode and catch up. But this time, we're doing that lesson's counterpart. We looked at fathers in a lesson that I called The Weight, and this time, we're looking at wives and mothers and their role. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the men and the children should just tune out. This actually will be very beneficial for you as well. It might help you to, better appreciate your wife or your mother. It might help you to help her. It might help you to avoid distracting her from doing the job that God has assigned to her. And some of you are raising daughters. I have very little idea what that's like because all of my kids are boys, but I trust that God knows what He's talking about, and so I'm going to relay what God has to say about it, and that, I hope, will help you. Now, in trying to establish the role that God assigns for wives and mothers, you might think that a good place for us to start would be to search for a good pattern, a character that we can follow, an example that shows us what wives and mothers today ought to be, and after which they can model themselves. And so we go through the Bible. We go right to the very beginning, and we think of the very first mother, Eve, so-called because she is the mother of all. We don't really have all that much information about her, and nearly all that we do have is less than complimentary. So maybe that's not the best example. Well, we jump forward quite some time in the story, and we come to Sarah, Abraham's wife, Sarah, and there are certainly things to imitate in Sarah. She's a great example in a lot of ways. Also, there are a lot of things to avoid, like, let's see, nagging, suggesting that your husband commit adultery, and then having the audacity to be upset when you get what you wanted. Maybe let's not look at Sarah. Let's move to the next generation after Sarah, Isaac's wife, Rebekah. Rebekah. Remember the story of Isaac and Rebekah and their sons Jacob and Esau? A bit of a sibling rivalry there, wouldn't you say? And you may remember that Esau was Isaac's favorite son and Jacob was Rebekah's favorite son. This arrangement didn't seem to work out all that well for anyone involved. Neither, by the way, did Rebekah's scheming and undermining her husband. You know what? Maybe let's not look at Rebekah either. Let's look at the next generation. One of those sons, Jacob, Jacob's wife, Rachel. Although I guess we could just as well look at Jacob's wife, Leah, and the fact that there are two of them is, well, it's not entirely their fault in fairness, but first of all, that illustrates that we're not looking at exactly the right pattern here, and second of all, while the fact that Rachel and Leah were not only sisters but sister wives was not completely their fault, them adding their maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah to the mix so that Jacob ends up with 4 wives, well, that was their fault. They're the ones who said, I'm not having any babies, I don't know, take her, and I'll have kids through her. We're having a tough time, aren't we? And when we jump forward several more generations and we come across Jochebed. She wasn't named in our reading here in Exodus 2, but that's the name of Moses' mother. Maybe we could use her as our pattern, our example. And really, we have no specific complaints that we could throw at Jochebed. We've got a lot of good things about her. I mean, the worst we could say is that she put her child in a basket and floated him down the river, but that was in an attempt to save him from the Egyptians who had, well, they wanted all of the baby boys of the Israelites to be killed. So that was about the best that she could do. But first of all, that's kind of an extraordinary circumstance. There's still plenty for us to learn from it. Second of all, we don't really know very much else about her. We've already read, for all intents and purposes, her entire story. There's just not that much there for us to work from. As we move along through the story, we come across other people, like the wife of Manoah, who is the mother of Samson. We don't even know her name. Again, there's some good things about her, but there's just not very much information. Maybe we could consider Naomi or Ruth. Well, I have very little bad to say about either of those two, but again, there's not that much information, and they are in exceptional circumstances where, for most of the story, they don't really fulfill the role of a wife and mother because they are widows, and Naomi is, for all intents and purposes, childless, although Ruth sort of steps in to fulfill that role for her. And we could think of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and, well, there's stuff for us to learn from her as well, but there's not that much information. Maybe we could learn from Athaliah, the lady who killed all of her grandchildren in order to make sure that she could stay on the throne. And you know what? On second thought, let's just completely throw her out. Nothing to imitate in her. There's kind of a running theme here. If we know very much about these women, then we generally see major failures. If we know very little about them, then sometimes we still see a lot of failures, especially in their kids. But if not, there's just not very much for us to go on. And there are a bunch of cases of highly unusual circumstances. It seems impossible for us to just find a nice, straightforward, simple example for women today to emulate. And that can be really frustrating. But it's not as if it's unique to wives and mothers. When we look for a great example of the perfect father on this earth, we have exactly the same problem. Either we find major character flaws or failures in their behavior, or they're in highly extraordinary circumstances that detract from the applicability of their example to us, or we just don't really know very much at all about them as fathers and as husbands. So, if you remember all the way back to last time, where did we go? We didn't look for a specific example of an earthly father. Instead, we looked at God's instructions and the sort of archetypes, the distillations of the basic pattern for, in that case, fatherhood, and simplifying it down to its absolute core concepts. And we looked at several passages, and most of these passages don't talk about just fathers and husbands. They also talk about wives and mothers. So, for example, we looked at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you, and encouraged you, and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Well, last time we were focused really on the father in this comparison that Paul is making, where he says that he and Timothy and Silas had behaved as a father does toward these new Christians. And even in that lesson, we contrasted the father's role with the mother's role. We have fathers who work and instruct and encourage, and then we have mothers who give and care and nurture. And interestingly, in this case, it's not even an instruction. It's just a recognition of the obvious fact. Remember, I said we were going to look at instructions, but also archetypes, and that's what we see here. It's just what motherhood and fatherhood are in the most stripped down terms that you can imagine. And so, if that's your position, if you are a wife or mother, and you read this and you recognize, as I said, just what motherhood is, then, well, the principle that Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes 9:10 is, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Do the best you can at this. We also looked at another of Paul's letters, Ephesians, in chapter 5, where Paul talks about husbands and wives, and we read verses 22 through 24. So let's read those again. Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Well, there's the wives portion, and it's pretty straightforward. It's certainly a useful reminder, but if you remember when we were talking about husbands and fathers, we actually looked at these same verses more than the instructions that Paul gives to husbands in the next several verses. So maybe if we kind of did the same thing, we would, take a gander at these few verses here where he says, wives do this, but maybe we should also look at the instructions that Paul gives to the husbands and see what we can learn from those instructions about wives. So let's pick up in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So that's great and all. It certainly gives us perspective on the responsibility that God has given to husbands, and you'll notice that it's a much longer list than what he said to the wives in just a couple of verses prior to that. But where do we see the wife in these instructions to the husband? In verse 26, we see Christ's role in purifying and sanctifying his bride, the church. And I suppose that's an illustration of the fact that you wives out there, you're not perfect. Now, of course, neither is your husband. He's not like Christ in this case. But the purpose for the family is to strive together toward perfection under the direction of the husband, who is accountable to God for how he leads. And I hear you saying already, but what if he's wrong? And I'll tell you, he's gonna be wrong sometimes. So it's not really what if he's wrong, it's what about when he's wrong. When he's wrong, and you know better, you've got some options. Would you rather, option one, bulldoze over his will and do things your own way instead, and in the process emasculate him and reject the pattern that Jesus has given us here completely? Or, as a second option, you could nag and belittle him so that he can't take your input seriously without constantly having to fight you in an unfair matchup, or else completely abdicate his responsibility as given to him by Christ. Or a third option, you could give input and gentle suggestions and show some grace and care and affection when he ignores them and it blows up in his face, so that maybe next time he's not so averse to considering your opinion before making his decision. I value my wife's input more than I value, well, any of yours, certainly, anyone's, because she and I are working together. She has made the conscious decision to submit to me, knowing my flaws, and to rely on me, and to support the decisions that I make, even when she doesn't agree, which happens from time to time. At the same time, I have made the conscious decision to love and to lead and to provide and protect to the best of my ability. And we're not perfect, but we do have a wonderful marriage. And it's not because we are closer to perfection than others are. It's because we know that we stink at finding our own way in this life, and we've decided to put our trust in God to lead us instead. Look at the job that your husband has been given, as Paul tells us in these verses. He says, "Husbands, love your wives." And he goes on about that at some length. What if the wife makes herself unlovable? What if the wife makes herself impure? What if the wife makes herself full of spots and wrinkles? Is that a recipe for marital bliss? Then don't do that. As a wife, you're supposed to imitate the church, and of course that doesn't mean imitate the problems. If you've ever read the letter 1 Corinthians, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you're supposed to imitate the ideal form of the church, the true unblemished bride of Christ. If you make that your pursuit, and your husband makes it his pursuit to love and cherish you, as Paul tells him to do here, you're both going to be very happy. Let's look at another passage. We didn't look at this one in our previous lesson, but 1 Peter chapter 3 actually has another wives do this, husbands do this section, and whereas in Ephesians 5 it was wives, here's a couple of things, husbands, here's a whole bunch. This time it's husbands, here's like one thing, wives, here's a whole bunch. So let's read what Peter says to wives in 1 Peter 3, beginning in verse 1. "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening." Every time I read this passage, my mind is just boggled that it doesn't get more attention than it does. Peter's giving essentially the same message, just like Paul said, submission. He said, wives, be subject to your husbands. Now, does that submission extend to denying Christ? If your husband says, curse Christ, are you supposed to be subject in that? Well, obviously not, because Peter says exactly the opposite of that. Even if he's not a believer, hopefully you can win him over by your respectful and pure conduct, he says. So the goal here, especially in that, is to differ from your husband, and in fact even go so far as to disobey him in such a way as to convince him to join you. That would be quite a feat. That sounds like it's impossible, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen it happen. Another time we will discuss the adornment and beautification thing from this passage in more detail, but for now, I'll give you a sneak preview to pique your interest. Our society right now has two opposite answers on beauty. The first answer is from the gutter, and it says that physical attractiveness is a woman's entire worth. And that physical attractiveness comes down to the exaggeration and oversharing of the more sensual and arousing aspects of the adult female body. Is that sterile enough? It's not easy to talk about this stuff, but I hope you get the picture. The other answer comes from wealth and power, and it says that a 900-pound woman, or alternatively a man dressed up like a woman, is beautiful and alluring, and that you're some kind of bigot if you disagree. Both of these are, of course, wrong. We've all seen the trend toward what's called body positivity, which is nicely encapsulated by the specter of ads for women's clothing and especially underwear featuring models who are, shall we say, representative of a country where more than 40% of adults are obese. Okay, it's realistic, sure. I'm also sure that it's less of an ego blow to women who are comparing themselves to the models that they see, who used to be far less realistic. Of course, those are ads. They're trying to get women to buy their product, but attractiveness is generally aimed at attracting the opposite sex. And I don't think we're going to see the same trend for advertising the so-called gentlemen's clubs. Nope, there you get the answer from the gutter instead. Like I said, both of these are wrong, but they also both have a point. They're distortions of reality, but if you look carefully, you can see reality hiding behind them. In any case, if all you can think about is being physically beautiful, you're missing the point. A gentle and quiet spirit. That's what Peter says that you should put on. Husbands and fathers are supposed to carry the weight. Wives and mothers are to put on a gentle and quiet spirit. If you can only remember one phrase from this whole program today, let it be that one, a gentle and quiet spirit. I can't say it enough times. If you keep that in your mind and you do your best to strive toward that goal as a wife and as a mother, then you're going to do great. There's often a major misconception about, well, that gentle and quiet spirit and what that looks like. If husbands are supposed to be in charge of their households and they're supposed to bring home the bacon, and wives are to submit and to nurse the babies and to otherwise be quiet and gentle all the time, well, then they're mostly just sort of sitting at home out of sight of society, speaking when spoken to, and contributing nothing but aesthetics and hot meals. That is not even close to the pattern that God has designed for women. We can see the pattern not in an individual. We already tried that approach at the beginning. We didn't get anywhere. But if instead we look at the ideal in Proverbs chapter 31, we're not describing an actual woman here, but we're describing the ideal form of any woman. And if all women today focused on being this, let me tell you, society would look very, very different. And we would all have to admit Solomon had it right. Let's begin in Proverbs 31, verse 10. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax, and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night, and provides food for her household, and portions for her maidens. She considers a field, and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength, and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor, and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. This semi-fictional lady is an absolute powerhouse. She is working hard and making money and preparing her family for whatever comes through her hard work and her intelligence. No one is looking down on her. No one thinks for a second that she's somehow worth less than a man. No one considers her to be property or a womb with a mouth. Her household could not function without her, just as it couldn't function without her husband. In fact, in either case, it wouldn't even be a household. It's very difficult to live up to this pattern. Verse 10 makes that clear. The whole thing starts out, an excellent wife who can find? It's rare. Why not resolve to be one of these women? It's not going to be an overnight change. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly everything's different. But if you start at the first line here and apply it to your own situation and work on that until you've more or less got it under your belt and you're ready to move on to the next one, and then keep doing that. First of all, it's going to take your whole life. And second of all, you'll be amazed at how the entire world around you gets brighter as a result. Because the effect that you are going to have on that world around you, it's going to ripple out and get stronger and stronger. Men, help your wives and daughters to be more like this. And show them grace when they fail, because they're going to. You don't think that you ever fail in your responsibilities either? More than that, remember that the church is also supposed to be Christ's bride. We saw that back in Ephesians chapter 5. And in some sense, the church is also a mother. The Apostle John describes the church that way in 2 John, the elect lady and her children. How much of this sort of stuff are you doing for God's household? Are you even a member of his household? The church provides for her children in all of the same ways as this, both physically and spiritually. If you're not a part of the church, then that makes you a wandering, purposeless, helpless orphan with no eternal home and nothing but despair waiting for you. But there's no limit to the love available in God's household. He doesn't have to worry like I have to worry sometimes about how many children are going to fit into his van. There's always room for one more. Are you ready to be adopted? If so, please get in touch with us at River Ridge, and we'll go through the process with you as God lays it out here in his Word. You can call or text us at 812-550-6234, or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. every Sunday for Bible study, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. for worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron. John describes the church. Go away. Who said you could be a part of this show? The church is supposed to be Christ's